to talk more about it now with criminal defense attorney Josh Ritter, host of the True Crime Daily podcast. So let me see, Josh, thank you for coming on. I'm going to start with kind of the bizarre nature of this and then go into some of what Alex said there at the end in a moment. But first, let's put up this AP article that talks about the headline, and then there's some detail at the bottom. It's on trial as Alex was reporting the deaths of his wife and the kids here. But this idea of the zombies, the couple claimed, as it says there at the bottom, they could tell if people had been possessed by dark spirits that could turn them into zombies. A former friend had testified about that in court, and they believe the only way to get rid of a zombie was to destroy the possessed person's body by killing them. Children's bodies were found buried in his yard in the summer of 2020. How does that play in a courtroom that just so not only a terrible and gruesome murder, but just such bizarre beliefs that surround it?
You know, the prosecution, one of the things the prosecution does not have to prove is motive, which might be surprising to some people. They have to prove the elements of the crime, but they don't have to prove the why behind it. But in a case like this, I think it's incredibly important that they do. They can provide that to the jury because the jury's biggest question that they're probably going to have in their minds is why? What motivated these people, a mother, to take the lives of her two children, and the stepfather or a father take the life of both his wife and these two children? And if they are able to hang their hats on this idea of these very bizarre and extreme religious beliefs, that just might be enough for jurors to understand enough for a conviction.
Okay, so that maybe it is distinct from other cases that you might look at. Now, what about the other point Alex was bringing up, having covered Lori's trial? So, as he said, there's differences here, death penalty in place, whereas it wasn't then. But what about, you can, I would suppose, learn a lot from that if you're prosecuting or even defending a case like this.
Yeah, the defense watched closely. Yeah. And I don't think it's much of the evidence that they're going to be surprised by, but I think they paid a lot of attention to the way that witnesses answered questions, especially on cross-examination. If you can see on a dry run how a witness handles certain questions and maybe perhaps pivot and ask different questions or in a different way to try to catch some of those prosecution witnesses off guard. But I think the biggest difference this time around is that we're actually going to see the defense make an argument. The first time with Lori Vallow's case, they were very passive, to the surprise of many people. And that's because we found out later that she was calling many of the shots and didn't want to get into too much of a defense, especially a built-in defense of blaming Chad Daybell. We didn't see any of that until a little bit in closing arguments. I think with Chad Daybell's trial, we're going to see a lot more of that. I think that he will be much more willing to throw her directly under the bus, place all the blame at her feet, and say that she's the one responsible and not him.
Okay, so let's dig into that a little bit. So you're saying they're going to make a more specific argument, but it's basically pointing the finger at her. So is there enough here, you think, from what you know about the evidence to, at least raise reasonable doubt making that argument, or no?
Reasonable doubt, I don't know. I think it makes an argument. I think they're going to be able to point some fingers. I mean, this is her children, and she does have these radical beliefs. She did make many incriminating statements, and they can point to all of that and say, listen, he believed in many of these things, but he had no idea the lengths in which she was taking all of this. Now, all of that might give them some grounds for argument. I don't know if it's going to persuade jurors, and it certainly doesn't help him out when it comes to the death of his own ex-wife, Tammy Daybell.
Right. So he had that's exactly what I was thinking when you were saying that, because his first wife is dead as well. So it's hard for you to look back, isn't it, and just say, oh, she was making this. She was a crazy person who kind of convinced me to do it. You still did it, and your first wife's dead. So.
Yeah, and realize, too, that the timing of all of this is incredibly suspicious. His wife dies. They believe at first that it's just natural causes. 2 weeks later, he's getting married to Lori Vallow, and they're in Hawaii, and within weeks of that, the children are missing. So all of this is just so close in time. They later on exhumed Tammy Daybell's body and do an autopsy, which was never performed when she initially died, do an autopsy and realize that foul play was probably took a role in her death. And so you're right, religious beliefs or not, putting aside even the evidence linking him to the children, he's still got to deal with the death of his own wife.
Crazy, yeah. And 2 weeks later, come on. All right, Josh, good to see you. Thanks a lot, Josh Ritter.